Without further ado, I'm now going to pass over to Andrew, and thank you, Andrew. Off you go.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you very much. I am very thrilled to be associated with Biz for Biz, and indeed I've been a member for some time, and to be given the opportunity to give this presentation. I'm afraid I'm a bit of a geek. I'm an unashamed geek in that I do enjoy helping owners move on to the next stage of their lives and help them on that journey. Before I go any further, I'd just like you to consider answering the following question. On a scale of 1 to 6, how ready do you consider yourself to be to transition away from your business and to do something else? Where 1 is, I'm not ready, and 6, I am ready. There are 2 supplementary questions that I just want you to bear in mind when I'm going through this presentation. If I asked you, do you want to sell your business? I really think there'll be very few positive answers. Whereas if I asked, would you like to be in a position to sell your business? I believe there would be a far greater positive response. I just want to stress that this presentation contains very much my own thoughts based upon my experience working with business owners, in the main in transaction values up to £10 million. Now, they may not be the thoughts of other advisors or indeed other business owners, but I hope that you will find this talk of interest. Succession involves several things. What do you want? When do you want to stop working? When the kids have left, or you've made enough money to stop? What do you want to do when you stop? Retire, be a non-executive, or undertake a new venture? Will the money you raise from the sale of your business be needed to fund your future gains in your retirement? And when you sell, are you going to withdraw gradually or stop completely at your chosen time? And are there other shareholders or partners to consider? And will they agree with your plans? I think all these considerations can be boiled down akin to 3 legs of a stool. So let's just summarize those in the next slide. I think we're talking about 3 things here: maximizing the transfer value of your business, ensuring that you've carried out your personal financial planning, and deciding what life will be like after you've put the succession plan in place. Now, whilst there's going to be emphasis on each of the legs, if 1 leg is missing, then the whole thing falls over. And I believe that when all 3 legs are aligned, you have what I would call a significant business. But let's first of all just take a step back. What is a successful business? Well, most business owners are trained to run a successful business. It grows, has reliable employees, regular customers, solid finances. It generates income for yourself. You can have a nice lifestyle from it. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But is it going to be growing such that there is value in the business? What are you going to do if what I call the 5 Ds, death, divorce, distress, dispute, and disability, come and rear their ugly heads? They can kill a business. And I think at the end of the day, you're going to want some value. But will someone pay top dollar for that business? The statistics show that something in the region of 70% of businesses put on the market fail to transact or are undervalued, whereas 75% of owners profoundly regret selling just 12 months after leaving their business. And I think that is due to not enough planning being put into their succession. So I believe a significant business goes a step further. It's one that is valuable, transferable, and attractive at any point. In other words, it's a business that you can sell if you want to, but you don't have to. While the business owner's personal and business financial goals are aligned. So let's dig a little bit deeper into significant business. It has strong, capable second-tier management. The accounting is accurate and transparent. There's been investment in technology, not only in your goods and your products and your services, but also in the processes and the systems that underline the business, that define its culture, its values. There's quality in the earnings. There's a predictability there that you can demonstrate to a buyer of what they're going to look like in the future. I do hate the word strategic plan, but it's a common word that's used. And it doesn't have to be hundreds of pages or miles and miles of spreadsheet. It really can be summarized in one page, setting out what you can achieve, when, and by whom. A lot of buyers look at growth opportunities, and I think you need to be able to have systems in there, such as CRM systems, customer relationship management systems, that's going to prove not only to you, but also to the buyer, how you think the turnover is going to be in the next few years. Needless to say, a strong brand nowadays on social media as well as elsewhere is actually quite important. But I think also you need to be aware of what your contracts with customers look like. Are there something in there called change of control clauses, whereby if there's a change of control, then the customer has the right to renegotiate the contracts. A few years ago, we were buying a business when this actually happened, and therefore one of the reasons we pulled out of buying that business was because of this change in control clause. You need to make sure you're not necessarily dependent upon one supplier, and those that you are dependent upon are in good state. In other words, you carry out some form of credit check on them to see how creditworthy they are. Likewise, lawyers need to look at your employees' contracts to make sure they're up to date, and whether or not for key employees there is a restraint of trade clause therein. So, okay, so this is the ideal. No one said it was easy to achieve. But in my experience, if anything to go by, it's unlikely you're going to maximize the chances of a sale, let alone receiving an offer, unless you have taken steps to prepare the business for succession well in advance of the date you've decided to leave. I also find that a lot of businesses are sold never having selling in their plan. Someone comes along and makes an offer. But the trouble is, if the business owner hasn't prepared for this and put the business in the best possible state, in other words, being in a position to sell it, it's likelihood that if you had been in that position, there would have been a higher value that would have been received had succession been in place. So I think you need to set out your stall. I think you need to be able to demonstrate, at least to yourself, that the business has increased in value, say over the last 4 years, and what it's worth now, and being able to demonstrate how that growth has happened, both in being a significant business and also in the value. A lot of business owners come to me and I help them market their business. And a lot of them say, oh, we give first-class service. And I see this in a lot of information that I get when I'm helping clients buy a business. And we then go to the buyer and say, well, what do you mean by first-class service? Because you're not going to say, I have second-class service. You need to be able to describe what first-class service means, why customers return to you, what do you do to make their lives better in a way that your competitors or like people do not do. You've got to differentiate yourself to make you special to the buyer. Do you have Do you have customer satisfaction surveys, such as the Net Promoter Score? Where are the profit drivers? I had an example a couple of years ago with a manufacturing business, which I'm afraid we were unable to sell. But they tried to do all things to all people, and they had a lot of products, but they didn't know how much profit, gross profit, let's say, they were making on each of those product lines. Likewise, they also didn't know how much stock was being tied up with those customers and how quickly those customers were paying. So it was very difficult to say, these are our best products, these are our best customers. So when they come to sell the business, they couldn't demonstrate this, and the buyers were put off. It's this ability to know what your profit is, and that in order to be able to explain to a buyer what you can do in the future. Now, I would never recommend that you undertake an acquisition in the year or so before you plan to sell, or make any other drastic changes, because if those go wrong, that could well delay your succession. Likewise, you can look at industries or countries, and if you like, have a wish list that can be displayed to the buyer when you come to talk to them, when you're in the process of negotiating the sale. Obviously, one of the questions that the buyer asks, that the vendor asks me, is how much is my business worth? Now, the key driver in all of this is profits. So I want you now to look at two businesses and ask yourself which one you would prefer to buy if you were the buyer. We have two businesses, one that has turnover of £1 million and another 800,000. But they both have the same profit before taxation. Now, I don't know which one I would want to buy, but I want my client to know which one he would like to sell to. For the simple reason is that the business with £1 million sales with a lower margin is more likely to be gain the interest of a financial buyer that just wants to add that revenue to their existing revenue, and then they, with their resources, can improve the gross profit. Whereas a strategic buyer might be more interested in business B because it has a higher gross profit, something that they don't have the resources to control, but at least they know there's a comfortable gross profit there that they can then use to harmonize that and bring in other products and services to the customers that they're already servicing. So knowing your buyer is actually quite an important part of the succession planning, because it can affect how you sell, and similarly who we approach with a view to selling. I don't know how much a buyer would pay for business A or business B, but at least knowing who that buyer might be can help you on the road. The value of a business is only real at the point of sale. In other circumstances, it is just subjective. And I carry out formal valuations in the cases of divorce or where there's disputes or even for inheritance tax purposes. But when I sit down face to face with a client and they ask me, well, Andrew, you've been doing this for years, you must know what my business is worth. The simple answer, I don't. I can have a view. And what I will say is, well, if you tell me your profits are X and we're going to work on a multiple of Y times earnings, then I'm going to say the enterprise value of your business is Z. And I'll come on to the enterprise value in a moment. There are only two numbers here that you can effectively play with. One is X, the amount of the profits, which is probably the easier one to deal with, rather than the multiple of those profits going forward. So for the purposes of this presentation, I really just covered the aspect of valuation. I now want to look at the personal side, the personal wealth. I think there's two parts to this. You really need a good idea of what you require money-wise in retirement. i.e., what's your goal and how are you going to get there? Now, the reality is that I think that every single one of us could probably retire tomorrow if we gave up a certain level of lifestyle and were happy to make sacrifices for it. Now, that's not going to happen because after a life of working, you're just not going to do that. So the financial advisors I speak to say that those business owners that have a clear idea of what they want to achieve takes a huge amount of stress and complications out of the succession planning, because it's something that's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a while, and you're going to get there by incremental decisions along the way. And if you know where you're going, it can certainly help in your efforts to build your wealth into the future. So I want to talk about wealth in a bit more detail and introduce you to something called your freedom point, which some of you may have heard of. It comes from a chap called John Warrilow in Canada of the Value Builder. And I do recommend his seminal book, which is here, Built to Sell, which is described as creating a business that can thrive without you. It's a very simple read. It takes about 3 hours, and he talks through a business with someone that owns a business and is working 24/7 in it. What he says is that essentially the freedom point is where an owner has sufficient wealth outside of the business. Why are they going to risk what is in the business by continuing to trade? So the question now is, how much is sufficient to be able to live your best life with the certainty that the cash will not run out? So to answer these questions, you really need a wealth advisor, and they have models that can give you the answer. You can do the simple numbers, and we're going to see some of those in a minute. But the wealth advisor will factor in your needs, such as buying a holiday home, helping the kids on the property ladder, paying school fees for the grandchildren, or whatever you want to do. But for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm just going to keep it simple. So we have this example where we're saying an income required in retirement is 60,000 gross. And so therefore the fund required is £2 million. Now your retirement fund as such is going to include all income generating assets outside the business. So that's your ISAs, dividends from shares, interest from bonds, ISAs, your pension funds, property. Let's say in this example, the owner has a value of £2.5 million. So I reckon the freedom point has been reached. So what is this particular owner's options? Well, why would they continue in business? Why would they risk their funds outside the business if they were to continue in business? And with all the kerfuffle we've had over the last few years, our fund's going to have to go into the business in order to make it survive. What other options are available to you? And I'll touch on these in a moment. Let's look at another example, though. £60,000 gross again, fund required 2 million. But this time, the gentleman or ladies fund is only 900,000. So they haven't reached what I would call their freedom point. They're 1.1 million short. And I'm afraid most business owners I come across are in this field. So that 1.1 million, that shortfall, that gap, is net of taxes, it's net of fees. And let's assume that for tax reasons, you haven't given shares to your kids or other employees or whatever. And let's assume for simplicity that the amount realized from the sale of your business will fund that shortfall. So working upwards, we need the net amount of 1.1 million. We know there's going to be some tax, let's call it 150,000, and we know there'll be going to be costs of 50,000. So therefore, the equity value of your shares is 1.3 million. So already we've put roughly another £200,000 on your requirement. But unfortunately, it may get worse than that. As I said, you tend to value a business on an earnings basis. That is, X profits times Y multiple will give you a value. But that value is something called the enterprise value. It's the value to the business of all the stakeholders. So that includes any loan holders. Now, if there's loans or leases or corporation tax, these are going to be adjusted to arrive at the equity value. In other words, if the enterprise value is 1.5 million, and let's say you have £210,000 worth of loans, then those loans will come off. But likewise, if you have surplus cash in the business, you've been storing up cash because you've been told, oh, that's a good idea, because when you draw it out on sale, it'll only be taxed at 10%. That can be added on because that's yours as the equity owner. So in this case, we're saying that the value of the business, the X is 500,000 and the Y, the multiple is 3, is 1.5 million. Now that is 40% higher than the 1.1 million, which we identified as the gap. And this is the problems that I'm facing with clients that haven't really addressed succession planning. If they know what their pension fund is worth or their income generating assets is worth, it's a great help. But people come to me and say, I need X for my business. And I say, is that net or gross? And at that point, their eyes cloud over. And that's why I have to go through this to say, well, actually, in this particular case, it's not 1.1, it's 1.5. And that is a big difference. And I do believe that's why succession planning is actually quite important. So in this example, let's say, how are you going to get there? Well, the possible options might be to fund a shortfall by way of pension contributions and then sell what's left of the business after all of that. That might be currently very tax efficient, but to fund 1.1 could take a long period of time. A more riskier option might be to invest in the business, to invest in the people, the systems, the processes, looking at who might buy you, and then increase the profits. And that way you will get to where you want to go. So in my example, if you put the profits up by 100,000 and left the multiple the same, you'd have 600,000 times 3, which is 1.8 million, which would be sufficient to fund that gap. Another alternative might be to sell now and reinvest the proceeds in another business, or bring someone in, take some of the money off the table and help and use that person's help and experience to grow the business, to grow the profits, which is probably the more easier than it is the multiple. But whatever you decide, you really should seek the advice of a financial advisor before deciding which of these routes to go down. Because the first one, the contributions to a pension fund, might in practice be the least risky of all of them. So I think we've covered the two legs of the stool. We've covered the valuation and we've covered your own personal position. I now want to look at the third leg of the stool, which is the most difficult, which is your readiness to move on to the next stage of your life. There's an institute in America called the Exit Planning Institute. I personally don't like the word exit because it implies an end, when in fact succession isn't necessarily that case. What they undertook was 2 surveys of business owners in Minnesota. And they did it over a 6-year period in 2017 and this year. So they asked these questions. Is succession planning a top priority? Well, you'll see, for the example there, that dial has moved quite significantly. Moreover, have they completed a formal exit planning education? Again, a lot more people had done this. They also asked whether or not you have a formal advisory team in place. Again, that had increased substantially. And by that, I mean, do you have a lawyer on board to look at those contracts, to look at those customer contracts, your employee contracts? Do you have a corporate financer on board to look at those multiples, to look at the way you can increase the profits? Do you have an IFA in place who's going to be able to advise you on your personal situation and so forth? Do you have a business coach maybe in there, or someone looking at your employees' contracts to make sure that they are compliant with the way HR is at the moment? But more important, perhaps is the last one. And this comes back to my point. Would you rather have a business that you could sell, even though you might not necessarily want to sell it? Is that a lot of them there over that 6-year period believed that the business was ready to transition to a new ownership. Many more were aware of what their options were, which I've dealt with very simply up till now. But putting a little more flesh on it, essentially, there are two options. You either have something called an internal exit, which I might define as a management buyout, or an employee ownership trust. The issue with both of those is that will the existing management, on the basis that there's not enough money in the company to fund a complete purchase of your shares at some stage, a completion, whether they have the ability to repay any loans that you've left in the business to satisfy the full consideration. And then there's also the external exit. That is where you have an outside buyer, i.e. a third-party buyer, such as a competitor or a private equity house, who would be keen on buying your business. So I think I've tried to demonstrate the importance of knowing what your freedom point is as part of your planning for succession. And as I say, I speak with too many clients who've decided to sell their business without knowing either one or both legs of the stool. Now, I can deal with one of the legs. A wealth advisor will deal with the other. But you need to consider that third. Looking at myself, I decided I want to leave my practice 10 years out. Now, that might be too long for certain people. But the third person I spoke to was the wealth advisor. And I said, I want a pension income of X when I leave the business. I have 10 years to fund it. What do I need to do? So I had that certainty. Unfortunately, it worked out. Now, for some of you, if you're in your early 50s, 10 years might be too far out. But those of us who are in their mid 60s or even later, 5 years is probably not too short a period of time, too long a period of time, once you know what your shortfall is. So let's just look at some of the options that the Planning Institute came up with in the States. Just under 50% of the business owners wanted to retire, and a third wanted to continue in business, either to serve on a board or become a consultant. A few wanted to do philanthropic ventures. Even less, surprisingly, wanted to buy another business. Now, for those of you that are clever, these percentages don't add up to 100. And the reason is that the Institute asked people to tick more than one box, which is why you can see that these numbers don't add up. But I think it's quite significant that there's quite a high number wanted to retire, meaning that you do need to know what your personal wealth is going to look like when you do retire, so you have enough cash to live off going forward. What they did discover was that not many people had appreciated that the business can go wrong before you retire. And I come back to these 5 Ds: the death, the divorce, the disability, which arguably is the worst of the lot, dispute, and distress. Now, I don't have time in this presentation to go into all of these, but I have come across them all in my career, and they do have considerable impact on the business. So at the very least, I think you need to prepare for those in some way. Do you have some form of life insurance? Do you have a key man insurance? What will happen to your business? What will happen to your spouse on your death, or if you become disabled? So I really think you have to sit down and address these points before even you talk about succession planning. But the two will start to knit together once your thought processes then come into place when you consider these 5 Ds. And in the Institute survey confirmed that 50% had no plan, 20% said they had, but it hadn't been documented, and only 30% had a written plan. I've been helping business owners, as I say, for over 30 years now. And what I try and do is to encourage them to change and what catalysts they need to make that change. Now, I've already spoken about the 5Ds, but if I may, there's some other areas that I think are a good idea to think about. Developing systems for a smoother operation is key because the business mustn't be you. I can recall an article recently in the Sunday Times by a fellow called Richard Harpin, who established and later sold Home Serve. And he said one of the best decisions he made in business was to give himself the sack. In other words, he wasn't crucial to the business when he came to sell it. And that's why you need to shift your mindset from a reactive to a proactive approach. I'm not saying it's easy, it isn't. When I decided to go, my thought processes changed, and I realized what I had to do in order to get out of the practice. And one of those, and I was very fortunate to do this, that I was able to hire and train the right people doing the right things right. And if you have those systems in place, then you've got the ability to hire people with the right attitude, that you can train them to do your things the right way, in the right manner. Developing the marketing and sales skills is again vital, because you need to be able to demonstrate to a buyer what your business could look like, because they are going to ask for forecasts. And if you can't give them, then you're in trouble. And I'll touch on this in a moment. But more importantly, those marketing and sales skills have to be with your team, so you can attract the clients you want to have for your business. So going back to that manufacturing company where they were trying to do all things to all people, what they should have been doing was looking at where their profits were, looking at where their more profitable customers were that were paying them, and maybe concentrating more on that to add value to the bottom line. I would say this as an accountant, but I don't just mean accurate, reliable, and regular accounts. Nowadays, with computer systems, and I'm not joking, you should be able to produce management accounts that are 90 to 95% accurate within hours of the month end. And I mean that. It shouldn't take days. When you get involved in selling a business, it can take 6 to 9 months. I recently completed a transaction, and that took something in the region of 10 months, and it was a very simple transaction. Fortunately, this was a purchase of own shares that didn't require a lot of accounts, but I have come across other situations, and you need the customer relationship management system in place. So let me give you just 2 examples. Say you're coming up to your year end. I'd be reasonably confident if you were to say to the buyer, by all means, give them a forecast of sales. I'm less happy about profitability unless you've got reliable management accounts. But let's say this process is going to take 7 months. In 3 or 4 months into the new year, where you've got 9 or 8 months left of the year, they're also going to be asking about forecast sales or forecast profits. And if you can't deliver them, or you can't deliver them with some form of accuracy, they are going to start chipping down on the price. But it's not only just the financial numbers. Go back to this 1-page strategic plan. If you have decided to put in a CRM system, that's not going to happen overnight, but you need little benchmarks to show that you're on the way. Likewise, if you've got to change your accounting system so that it can produce the accounts more quickly, that's not going to happen overnight, but you need these benchmarks in there. So the financial statements, if you like, are not only just numbers, but they're also, if you like, milestones on the way to the end result. Why isn't that happening? Okay. The other one, I talked about being proactive rather than reactive. Probably some of you have heard of Michael Gerber's book, The E-Myth Revisited, where he talks about working on and not in the business. And he says why small business don't work and what to do about it. And this is a fireside chat with a lady that has a bakery business that is really struggling. It's about a 3-hour read, and it's very insightful. The last tip is slightly controversial, but I believe that it is important that you find someone outside your business, whether that's a business coach or a business mentor or someone that's done it before, to help you on that road of succession. For those of you that have been governors of school, we've been described as critical friends who are on your side to achieve your desired outcome. And I think this person is more of a critical friend, holding you to account. Now, a lot of people say it doesn't work, and that's possibly because of several things. But I think what you have to do, and again, I'm being controversial now, is you have to pay them on a monthly basis, because that means you've got some skin in the game. Because if you're paying someone, then the chances are you're going to do what you've agreed to do in a month's time. But likewise, I think that person should have some skin in the game. You could maybe give them a very small shareholding in your company, or you could give them a success fee at the end of it. But I think the pair of you need to have some form of skin in the game in order to make it work, so that you're both being focused towards that end goal. Now, there's lots of opportunities out there for business owners to help with succession planning. And I think one of the opportunities is to immerse yourself in education. If you Google the words exit or succession planning, there's a whole load that will come up. Reading books. I mean, there's another one here by Bo Burlingham called Finish Big. And he describes it as how great entrepreneurs exit their businesses on top. I would say this, but there's a lot of help sheets on my website, and there's many other ways that you can educate yourself. But at the end of the day, I think you have to concentrate on value and on profits, not just building a business that's great for lifestyle, but building a business that's going to survive the 5 Ds and then take you on to succession. Be aware of the range in the valuations and how that's changed over that, let's say, that 4-year period. What's happening in your sector, what's happening in your industry, how the values are changing, and appreciate that value gap and the profit gap that you need to bridge. Have that personal purpose and vision, and establish a team so that business is there without you. I do come across people that don't have a plan, and I've spoken about life assurance and critical illness, etc. But what will you do? Now, there's nothing wrong in just liquidating the business, providing you're happy, you've got enough money to retire on and live a nice life. But then I speak to other people that say, well, I'm going to speak to the kids and see if they want to take it over. They come back in 6 weeks' time and say, no, Dad, we don't want your problems. Thank you very much. You go and do what you want. There are a couple of quizzes on my website, which you're very welcome to have a look at. One covers, are you ready? And the other covers whether or not the business itself is ready. You could undertake these, let's say now, and then do them again in 6 months' time and see how things have changed. But I hope that they will give you some idea on how to make this succession plan work. I would like you just to go back to this original question. On a scale of 1 to 6, how ready do you consider yourself to be transitioning away from your business to do something else? And I hope this presentation has moved the score up 1. At least. I have to put in this disclaimer because A, I'm not a wealth manager, and B, the tax that I spoke about, this 10% tax, is only at the moment with a new government. That could easily change. Anyway, thank you for listening, and I'll pass you back to Ian to see whether or not there are any questions.